Good evening. Welcome back to another episode of What Not to Do when applying to a police department. Um, this week, I've had a fairly long back and forth with an officer in charge of my background investigation at the department where I have now applied twice. I was hoping to get the same background investigator so I could really come clean in person about some things, and that didn't happen. Where things sort of dead ended was the department requested that I give them copies of all my medical records pertaining to psychiatric hospitalizations. In particular, one in 2012 appears to have triggered this line of inquiry. In 2012, I was hospitalized for 2 nights and 2 days in New Haven, Connecticut, because I was sexually assaulted by my roommate at the time, and I guess you could say I went into shock about a week or so later when he came to get his things from the apartment. I was not sleeping, not eating right, had a lot going on. I was trying to go to grad school. I was working 2 jobs. And I was on the phone with my therapist actually when this happened. And I think she called the ambulance. And when the police came, I just wasn't verbal. So they took me to the emergency room. And then things went from there. And I was given Benadryl and Ativan so that I could sleep. And when I had woken up the next day, I wanted to go home, but I was told that there was no attending physician on to sign my discharge papers, so I would have to wait another day, which I did. Unfortunately, I wasn't insurable at the time because I was considered to have a pre-existing condition of bipolar disorder, and this was pre-Obamacare. I was working as a personal trainer, and the industry wouldn't take my money even though I didn't smoke, and my job was to work out, be healthy, and teach other people how to be healthy. And all the gyms that I work for, I was an independent contractor, so that was a no-go. I do remember attempting to buy insurance and a man coming to the house and interviewing me for a policy. And when he asked me about the bipolar disorder and hospitalization when I was 20, he basically said, no way, that's a pre-existing condition, so we can't take your money. And I remember there being this moment when I was very angry at the unfairness of it. You see, when you're a personal trainer, you have to be fit and in pretty tip-top condition in order to work. So everything that is minor or copable becomes more of a stressor because you can't work sick, and if you can't get to the doctor and get what you need, it snowballs. And I remember listening to this man and literally saying to myself, do not go off on him, because if you do express outrage, this person will think that you are manic, and it will be humiliating for you. So I just kind of glared at him as he left the house. Now it appears that because police were called and an ambulance was called, that the way that the system has processed this event for me is as some sort of involuntary commitment, which would prohibit me from owning firearm in some states, and of course prohibit me maybe from being a police officer. So I told you there were numerous DQs, as they're called, disqualifying factors, and I promise that I will discuss them more in detail. What I want to say right now is that the assault was very minor. It was 4th degree. What had happened was I had gotten into this grad school program, this MFA program for creative writing, and I felt really positively about taking this step because I felt like I was finally doing something for me besides surviving and working. I was in a place in my life where, sorry for the background noise. I had decided that I had been told for a long, long time that I didn't have what it took to be an independent adult. That's how I spent most of my 20s. I thought I was an invalid. I thought I was a mental invalid. And it wasn't the case. I had spent a year as a reporter and been laid off. And I had moved to Connecticut without any real social network there and spent a lot of my time cultivating sources and working. I'm an introvert, but I gravitate towards jobs where extroversion is either an advantage or the norm for people in those professions. So at the end of the day, after reporting, I didn't have a lot of energy to have a personal life. And then I didn't really develop a lot of close friendships in the area. And then I had a live-in boyfriend after my divorce. He was actually a fellow reporter. He got my beat because he had seniority. And I didn't feel like the relationship had anywhere to go because I wasn't willing to get married and settle down again after having been married since I was 19. So I tried to just be on my own and be independent, because dependency, particularly on a man, had been another large feature of my life It didn't make me very happy. So I guess my point is, by the time that this happened, I didn't really have people around that I could really like lean on. My family was A, far away, and B, horrid and toxic and dysfunctional. I didn't even tell my dad that this had happened because he was drinking heavily and not doing very well. And I knew he would blame me, and I blamed me a lot. I didn't blame myself for what my roommate had done. I blamed myself for having to have a roommate in the first place. So I went out one night, had a few beers, like 3, at this concert, and was that was very uncharacteristic of me at the time. But I was celebrating the fact that I had gotten into this MFA program, and I came home, and my roommate asked me, how I was. And this was after, I guess, months of him living there. Within a couple of weeks of him moving in, I looked at him and I said to myself, I'm living with a low-level predator. That's what I told my friends. There were numerous incidents leading up to it. There were overtures that I rejected. It was pretty clear to me that he was not like all together. So came home, he asked me how I was, and I said, I'm drunk, I'm going to bed. And I was brushing my teeth, and I remember thinking, you shouldn't have said that. And I thought, I've waited for this shoe to drop for so long. I was like, just let it drop. And I went to bed, and I woke up, and he was on top of me. And I didn't know how long he had been there. That was the freakiest part, was that because I had been asleep, I had no sense of how much time had passed. And it literally felt like he had been there for hours, crouching over me. And I remember thinking, because he had me pinned down with one arm, and I remember thinking, and one arm was on the bedside table, and I remember thinking in a flash that if this becomes a fight, it will be a fight that I can't win physically. I can't win it. It didn't become a fight. He just groped me, and I said some things, and he left. But I didn't want to have to live with that. I didn't want to have to live with a person that I would constantly look over my shoulder and wonder if the behavior was going to escalate. Okay. So I reported it because I needed a legal leg to stand on in order to have him evicted. And that was my goal, and that was my purpose. I didn't want to see him have a record. I didn't want to see him on the registry for something as minor as 4th degree sexual assault. And my point now is that my response was directly proportional to the severity of the crime. However, I didn't give him life compromising consequences. He didn't have a record. It wasn't going to follow him, for instance, when he was seeking employment. and it wasn't going to cost him. He had a child too. That was another factor. And he didn't make very much money. So that was another thing I was thinking in my head. And I now have to live with the fact that getting psychiatric help has had a life compromising consequence for me. In addition to the $25,000 that the hospital billed me for 2 nights of Benadryl and Ativan. That was the adjustment disorder diagnosis. I asked the psychiatrist what she thought the diagnosis was, and she was really uncomfortable, and she was really hesitant in giving a diagnosis at all, given the circumstances. So it's just something to think about. Is it helping? Is all this mental health care helping? Another thing that I was thinking about was I've got to get strong enough to face a psych eval and fail. They're not going to give me one because why would they spend the money? But that was my goal, just get farther in the process. Psych evals have been part of the police hiring process for, I don't know, 20, 30 years now. And I would like to ask the question, is it helping? I keep thinking about this video I watched with a younger officer talking about what you're not supposed to say and how easy it is to fail these things. And also, I keep thinking about the ever expanding, encroaching role of psychology in our lives. And this term social engineering keeps coming up. I know that means hacking, but this is my question. The younger officer actually said, you know, they didn't used to do these things. So that's why you see these older officers and they're so fucked up, basically. That wasn't my experience or impression from being around police full time for a year. That was definitely not my impression. I'm concerned that the techno bureaucrats, it's like mentally ill people who take loads of medication and then they still experience the symptoms that the medication is supposed to treat or control. And the assumption is that if they weren't on the medications, the symptoms would be so much worse, and then they're scared as shit because they're intimidated and they're coerced into believing this, and it's all based on an assumption. So if we have had this process for 20 or 30 years, and it has basically designed the population of police officers that we currently have, I have to ask, how is it working out for you? How's it working out? Is it improving things like recruitment and retention? Because recent headlines state that there is a massive labor shortage in this country. And that might be due to public perception of police. So is it improving public perception? of police? What about excessive force cases, brutality, domestic violence rates, or corruption? Is that better or worse? I don't know. These are things for me to think about and research. Is the assumption that they would be that much worse if we didn't have, during the hiring process, a strict process that's designed to weed people like me out? It's just something to think about. That's enough for tonight.